During the summer of 2024, I took my second road trip of more than 10,000 miles across North America. I saw family and friends at various locations, and some of them rode along on parts of the trip. The purposes of the trip were to look for Connecticut warblers and other birds and to enjoy the scenery. Birds are most active and easiest to find in June, but higher elevations at some of the parks are closed until later in the summer. So it made sense to do the trip in two phases. I began the first phase in Alexandria, Virginia on May 29th. After stopping to visit relatives in Pennsylvania, I drove north to Kenora, Ontario, and then west to Riding Mountain National Park and Duck Mountain Provincial Park in Manitoba. After going south to visit relatives in Montana, I drove back north to Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan, and then west to Jasper and Banff National Parks in Alberta and British Columbia. I made a stop near the northern tip of Idaho to deploy a game camera that transmits photos by cell and has a solar panel. I then drove back into Montana to Glacier National Park. After a brief stop to reposition the game camera, I headed west to Seattle, Olympia, Portland, Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park in Northern California, and Tillamook in Oregon. During the trip back to the east, I visited Powder Mountain and Great Salt Lake in Utah, Dinosaur National Monument in Utah and Colorado, and Fort Riley in Kansas. The trip odometer read 11,452 miles when I arrived back in Alexandria just after midnight on July 2nd. The inset map shows an even longer road trip that I took in 1997. Back then, I didn't own any cameras. For this trip, I had a Nikon Z6II, 400 and 560 millimeter lenses, a 24 to 200 millimeter zoom lens, a DJI Phantom 4 Pro drone, a Sony PCM D100 audio recorder, and a Sony 4K video camera. During the second phase of the road trip in August, I visited Yellowstone National Park, returned to Idaho to upgrade the game camera setup, visited areas in Glacier National Park that were closed in June, and revisited Dinosaur National Monument. I drove 6,512 miles during the second phase for a total of 17,964 miles. This photo shows Lake of the Woods near Kenora. This area is in the range of the Connecticut Warbler, which is a hard bird to find. I saw one in Manitoba in 1997. I returned to Canada in 2023 and found a Connecticut Warbler in the black spruce bog shown here, which is located to the west of Kenora. I obtained video footage of that bird, but regretted not being able to spend more time in the area that year. In 2024, I decided to return to the area and spend more time searching for Connecticut warblers. I used a drone to get views of the habitat from above. Various types of habitat appear in this image. Shortly after beginning our first day in the field on June 2nd, we found a Connecticut warbler in the black spruce bog appearing on the right in this image. Here are some photos of that bird. Later that day, we checked the location where a Connecticut warbler was present in 2023, but there was no sign of it. In the same area on June 5th, however, we heard a Connecticut warbler that might have arrived that day and might have been the same bird from the previous year. While inspecting a drone video that was obtained on June 3rd, we noticed that we had walked just to the side of a spruce bog appearing in the upper right part of this image without realizing it was there. We returned the next day and immediately heard a Connecticut warbler singing. It was exciting to find that bird using the drone. Our next stops were at Riding Mountain National Park and Duck Mountain Provincial Park in Manitoba on June 6th. We had great views of a bear and her cubs that appear in these images. It was a bit rainy, but I saw a bird that I had never seen before. A yellow rail flushed from nearby, flew a short distance, landed, and then disappeared into some reeds. After a side trip to visit family in Montana, I arrived at Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan early on June 10th. I found 2 Connecticut warblers just beyond the creek appearing in this image. Drones aren't permitted in the park, but this image was obtained from just outside the boundary. In this part of its range, the Connecticut warbler nests in aspen forests. This photo shows one of the birds perched on an aspen. I saw bears during every trip up and down the main road in the park and obtained these images. On June 11th, I found another Connecticut warbler that appears in these images. On June 12th, I drove west to near the northern boundary of Jasper National Park. I spent the night in the town of Hinton that appears in this image. On June 13th, I drove down the Icefields Parkway that goes through Jasper and Banff and obtained these photos. On June 14th, I followed an unpaved road several miles into a forest in northern Idaho to deploy the game camera. The surrounding forest appears in these images. I selected this area because it's in the range of grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, moose, and elk. It was hard to find such an area that has cell coverage. I climbed up a small ridge, hoping that a casual hiker would be unlikely to find the camera. The camera and solar panel appear mounted on a tree in this image. A moose walked past the camera at close range during the night of June 25th. In this image from 3:18 a.m., the muzzle of the moose is visible, and the camera reports a temperature of 39 degrees. In this image from 3:21 a.m., the right eye is visible, and the temperature has risen to 45 degrees, apparently due to the body heat of the moose standing close to the camera. In this image from 3:22 a.m., the belly and a leg are visible, and the temperature is 46 degrees. In the final image from 3:23 a.m., the temperature is 48 degrees. There was a 9-degree rise in temperature during the 5 minutes the moose was near the camera. On June 29th, the camera captured this photo of the head of a deer during the daytime. On June 15th, I visited Glacier National Park and obtained these images. While visiting family in Olympia, I had my oil changed for the second time during the trip and installed a roof box. On June 20th, we visited the Columbia River Gorge and had nice views of Mount Hood and waterfalls. On June 21st, we visited the Rose Garden in Portland. On June 22nd, we visited several vineyards in Oregon. On June 23rd, we visited Crater Lake National Park and obtained these images. On June 24th, Steve Sillette and Marie Antoine took us on a hike through Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park, where we obtained these images of the towering giants in that forest. Early on June 27th, I visited high elevations on Powder Mountain to look for mountain bluebirds. In the middle of the day, we visited Great Salt Lake. We spent the rest of the day driving through parts of Wyoming, Utah, and Flaming Gorge. Early on June 28th, we visited the Bone Quarry on the Utah side of Dinosaur National Monument and obtained these photos. Later in the day, we visited the Colorado side of Dinosaur National Monument. The road was littered with thousands of locusts that had been crushed under car tires and were providing a feast for birds. This attracted a bird that I'd never seen before. we came upon 2 adult sage grouse with 8 young feasting on the locusts. Along the trail to Harper's Corner, we saw the most spectacular scenery of the entire trip, which appears in these images. On June 29th, we focused on driving eastward. Late in the day, we stopped in eastern Colorado to get some audio recordings with the Sony PCM D100. At the same time, I ran Merlin, which detected a Baird sparrow. I figured that this must be a mistake, but there's an article about this species nesting in eastern Colorado. I did my final bird watching of the trip during the morning of June 30th outside of Junction City, Kansas. Later that day, we visited the Fort Riley Army Base, which has an impressive museum and a house where Colonel Custer once lived. Near the center of the U.S., the trip odometer hit 10,000 miles. Despite lots of driving in mountains and some with a roof box, my 2019 Subaru Outback averaged 30.5 miles per gallon. The trip odometer read 11,452 miles when I arrived back in Alexandria a little after midnight on July 2nd. During the break between the phases of the road trip, I drove 2,000 miles pulling U-Haul trailers while moving furniture between 3 houses. During that period, there were 2 additional moose events at the game camera. A female showed up on July 14th. A male showed up the next day. A bit later, the camera indicated that it was no longer using the solar panel. At the time, it was a mystery why it stopped working. I arrived at Yellowstone National Park on August 9th. Early that day, I had an excellent view of a group of sage grouse and obtained these photos. Buffalo are common and easy to see at Yellowstone, but I still enjoy seeing them. As a child, I became interested in conservation after hearing about how the buffalo was nearly driven to extinction, and my favorite coin was the buffalo nickel. I developed a simple population model for the buffalo nickel, which is consistent with the fact that they were becoming hard to find in circulation by the mid-1960s. I obtained these photos of buffalo in Yellowstone. In the afternoon of August 9th, I saw a grizzly bear with two cubs and obtained these photos. I spent parts of August 9th and 10th watching the wolves near a den in the Lamar Valley. As shown here, the den is about a mile from the observation point. Despite the distance, I was able to get some fairly good photos with the 560mm lens, which are presented along with audio from the same location. I asked an experienced observer of the wolves in Lamar Valley to listen to a recording that I obtained in Manitoba in June. His opinion was that those vocalizations which follow are from wolves. I visited the game camera in northern Idaho on August 11th. As shown in this photo, the power cord became disconnected, perhaps during a storm. The power cord also came off the solar panel. To prevent this from happening again, I secured the connector with electrical tape as shown in this photo. As shown in this photo, I installed a Pelican case with 3 rechargeable batteries, set up a better solar panel to keep the batteries charged, and deployed an extra game camera in hopes that at least one of them will remain operational for a long period of time. These photos show the views from the 2 cameras. On the way to Glacier National Park, I obtained the photos that follow of a kind of outdoor car museum. While I was stopped along the road to take those photos, a Model A Ford drove by. On August 12th, I got out of bed at 4 a.m. in order to arrive at the parking lot at Logan Pass in Glacier National Park before the parking lot got filled up. I obtained these photos along the Highline Trail. I obtained the video footage that follows along the Highline Trail. During the morning of August 13th, I visited Waterton Lakes National Park, which is an extension of Glacier National Park into Canada, and obtained these photos. During the afternoon of August 13th, I took the trail to Hidden Lake Overlook and obtained the photos that follow. I visited Dinosaur National Monument on August 16th and obtained the photos that follow. Various videos, photos, and audio recordings follow in the remainder of this presentation.